Welcome back to another episode of Revamped Outdoors. My name's Elliot. It's winter in Wisconsin, so it's negative 80,000 degrees, and my lips are cracked, and can't get out of the house because of the snow drifts, and car won't start. And anyway, today's episode 4 of the Making a Jig series. So in the last 3 episodes, the first one we went over CAD, second one we went over how we made the mold, and the third one is how we made skirts for the actual jig that we put together. So this fourth one is taking the molds that we made in episode 2, and we're actually going to pour lead into them. So what I'm using here is a Lee pour pot. I got to do a kind of a standard disclaimer here. Lead, it's dangerous. It's poisonous to the human body, and also it's hot because you have to melt it to move it. So there's a couple things to really keep in mind here is you can burn yourself. And also you want to do this in a well-ventilated area just because not necessarily boiling off the lead because we're just going to melt it down to a melting point, but it's still going to release some gases off of there, especially depending on where you're getting your lead. So I get my lead from wheel weights. The wheel weights were traditionally lead, all lead, and now they've moved into some zinc and some other metals that are inside the wheel weights. Zinc has a slightly different boiling points and stuff like that. It actually evaporates off, so you have to be rather careful with that. I would advise just getting lead standard, like an actual 99 or 99.9%, whatever they want to try and market it as actual lead if you wanted to do this. I'd also recommend maybe looking into alternatives to lead. Something like pewter should work. It's never going to really melt in your tackle box. It won't ever get that hot in your tackle box, but it'll be a little less dense, so it's going to be a little less heavy. But it's a whole lot safer to work with, and this process would be the same with pewter as it is with lead. So everything that I talk about from here on out would work just the same. So a couple things to keep in mind there, a little disclaimer. Obviously, this is dangerous. Wear the proper PPE, the personal protective equipment, and just have fun with it if this is something you wanted to do. Like I said in video 2, I'm probably going to get away from actually melting and using lead just because in video 2 we saw how we could use urethane or epoxy with some lead shot to do the same thing and complete the same goal. So I'm probably going to get away from this method, but I think people might be interested in seeing if lead can actually work with the MoldMax 60. So we'll just jump into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up the leaf pour pot. This is a little bit cost prohibitive, but if you do any casting of any sort, it's definitely worth it, I think. I do a lot of casting for handgun rounds, and then I also did a lot of walleye jig casting in lead, just ball head jigs. This really helps out. It's a lot better than having to pour by hand, and it just makes things a lot more consistent. So I think it's worth the investment. But I'm setting the pour pot to 3. I tried doing it up to 5, and then I tried doing it down to 2, and it seemed like that it would take off a little bit of the silicone from the MoldMax 60 molds if it was any higher than 3. Any lower than 2, it would set up too quickly in the mold, and you'd get like half a cast or something out of the jig itself. So I kind of settled into about 3 here for the temperature. I'm not really sure what that is in actual temperature units. It's kind of hard to measure molten lead because it gets up past that 500 mark. So like the infrared thermometer doesn't quite work so hot, but that's a good guideline. If you do have a Lee pour pot, number 3 seems to work well in the MoldMax. I'm not going to guarantee that it won't break apart the MoldMax because it will. It's going to eventually just tear it apart. But I think I've gotten like up to about 10 jigs now at this point in it, and it's still holding up pretty well. Some of the layer lines are breaking down, so that to me means that the silicone's breaking down a little bit, but not too crazy. The next part we have to figure out is how we're going to get the weed guard in there, because the weed guard is just a nylon fiber material. If you put the nylon in there and then pour in the lead, it just melts the nylon right off. So we can't really do that. The dogs. That's cool. Cool. So what I found was the nylon material weed guards, the FG30s that I designed into this mold, they're about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. And that works really well for like 10 penny nails. It works really well. So I just took a nail, cut off the head, cleaned it up a little bit on the grinder so it would fit in there well, and I just put that in place of the weed guard for the lead pour. So then I just pour the lead in and around the nail, and then once it sets up, I let it, set up for a little while, cool down. Then I can remove that nail, and then I have a spot where I can put the weed guard. And this seemed to work out really well, no real large complaints. So there's a couple different ways of finishing these jigs. You can paint them with traditional jig paint, you can use nail polish, or you can use a type of powder coat. I prefer the powder coat just because it's a little bit quicker and easier. All you have to do is hit it with a propane torch, heat it up a little bit, put the powder coat on it, and then it'll melt on there and kind of set onto the jig. It's a lot easier, it's a lot nicer, I think. It just makes it kind of a more of a finished jig. And then when I'm doing that, I can leave the nail in there and then take that out at the same time for my weed guard spot. So it seems to work out pretty well. I also like the powder coat because once it's starting to kind of set up and it's still a little wet, you can dip that into glitter, and that glitter will kind of push into that powder coat. And then you can do like a clear coat on it later. You can dip it in. I dipped it in polyurethane. That seemed to work pretty well. I just dipped it a couple times in there, let it set up and dry. Pretty easy to do, not really a whole lot of work for me, so I like those kind of projects. The easier it is for me, the happier I am. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the Molmac 60 and how it performed. I didn't think it would hold up that well to lead repeatedly over and over again, but it did. It worked pretty. Actually, I'm really happy with it, and I could continue using it, so that's a win for me, I think. And then there's a couple different things. We made our own skirts in the previous video. If you haven't seen that, check it out. I'll put it down in the description below. But also you can buy just store-bought jig skirts for this too, like Do It Molds. They have their own line of jig skirts, and I've put them on these before. They just look a little bit sparse for my taste. I like the thicker ones that we made in the previous video with making skirts for the jigs. So I like that a little better, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that. Just go out and buy skirts. Sometimes you can get those on sale, and they work out pretty well. Hopefully you enjoyed that a little bit. Hopefully it was slightly entertaining. If you did, maybe leave a like. Maybe consider subscribing. It's YouTube. Got to say that stuff. And I like making things for the out of doors with a 3D printer, so if that's something you're into, make sure to stick around. Got some musky baits on the 3D printer now. Not really much of a musky fisherman, but they're big baits. They're impressive to look at, and they're a lot of fun, kind of complex to make, so it's a little bit up my alley. So I'm giving it a try. Still pretty new at it, but we're gonna forge through. We're gonna make it happen. So yeah, hope you have a great day, evening, night, weekend, whenever you're watching this, and until the next one, keep your amps up and your filament dry. Come here. Come here. Get up here. Yeah. Yeah. This is the guy making all the noise. Aye. You gonna say hi to everybody? Yeah?